Today I want to give you some information to use for integrating sources correctly using MLA format, and we're going to be using a very simple paragraph construction that really just focuses on the ways to incorporate textual evidence from a primary source. So this is an example of a paragraph where the student has good content but has used a dropped quotation. So a dropped quotation is, it could be one of two things. It could be that the student forgot to put the parenthetical citation, or that the student did what this student has done and has written a sentence that just starts with a quote and ends with a quote. So there is no introductory phrase of any kind. So let's take a look. We're going to spend the whole time revising this section of text and looking at different ways this student could have chosen to revise the incorporation of this quotation. So here is one way you could revise this and fix the quotation, the dropped quotation problem. You could use, instead of where the student had a period here, you could use a colon and still keep the introductory sentence. This is a full sentence before the quote, but a period means full stop, and we want to keep the quotation within a sentence we have written as writers. So a colon will continue the sentence and connect what we are writing to introduce the quotation to the quotation itself. Now, a full stop here, where it would have been in the original text, doesn't belong until we have cited the source as well. So we need the author's last name and the page number. There is no P period, no page, no comma here, just last name of the author and page number, and then the period goes after the parenthetical citation. Another way to introduce the source would have been a simple signal phrase, just the author's name and then writes, or the author asserts, whatever kind of source you're quoting. You'll want to use a verb that fits there. So you wouldn't want to say Whitehead says, because Whitehead is not speaking, he is the author, he is writing. In fact, if there is a speaker at all, it would be the narrator. So if we wanted to say that someone is saying something, then we would say Whitehead's narrator says. But here the writer is Whitehead, so we can say Whitehead writes, and then comma for this type of signal phrase, and then the quotation, no period until after the parenthetical citation. Now, unlike the last parenthetical citation that had the last name of the author, this one just has the page number with no P period, anything like that, just the page number itself. And the signal phrase has the author's last name, so that's why we don't have to have it there. So if we did not have the author's name to introduce the quotation, we would need it in the parenthetical citation. So let's look at any problems we can find here. So we have a major theme of the novel is trauma. Elwood has endured much trauma in his life and has a hard time letting go of his past. Whitehead states, still felt the old days in his back sometimes, a twinge and a quiver. Whitehead states, still felt the old days in his... That just doesn't sound like something that I would say out loud and have it make sense. So when you are reading your sentences that contain a quotation, you need to read it aloud and think, is this how I would say this to a friend? If you wouldn't structure that sentence in a way that you would say out loud and your friend would understand it, then that is not a good way to introduce the source or incorporate the source into your writing. Another problem is a full stop here. We don't need a full stop until we have included the source citation, the parenthetical citation there. So I have highlighted the problems Whitehead states that doesn't really fit there, and the period there is a problem. You want to make the quotation fit the grammar of your sentence. Like I said, if you read it aloud and it sounds like something that would just naturally flow from you as a way of explaining what someone has said or someone has written, and your listener would understand, then that is probably a grammatically correct sentence. So let's look at this one. A major theme of the novel is trauma. Elwood has endured much trauma in his life and has a hard time letting go of his past. Elwood still felt the old days in his back sometimes, a twinge and a quiver. So this time we're just using the name of the character and writing what is written about him, written by Whitehead. So you don't always have to use Whitehead writes. You can just integrate the quotation in a way that naturally flows in the grammar of the sentence. So you don't have to force a signal phrase out. And a way to introduce something can just be with a lead-in that gives some context or background or says who is speaking, or for example, this is just information about Elwood, so this works well here. Again, we didn't use a signal phrase with the author's name, so we have to have it here. And we dropped the period at the end of the quotation and put it after the parenthetical citation. All right, next. Use a lead-in that makes the quotation fit with the grammar of your sentence. Again, here's another example. I could say, a major theme of the novel is trauma. Elwood has endured much trauma in his life and has a hard time letting go of his past. Whitehead writes that Elwood still felt the old days in his back sometimes, a twinge and a quiver. So this time I have put Whitehead, the author's name, in the sentence, and I have writes that Elwood. So then I don't need Whitehead's name in the parenthetical citation. And then I have revised that last sentence. I haven't read it to you yet, I don't think. He tries very hard to repress his memories from his younger days, but he's unable to do so. Clearly, the trauma still impacts him mentally, physically, and emotionally. So each slide, you may notice the last sentence has changed a bit. And every time I look at a piece of writing, I find new ways that it could be better. And that is what you should be doing every time you look at your writing as well. In fact, as I continue to look at this one little snippet, it's not even a fully developed paragraph yet, but this little section that addresses a theme really evolved to a 3-point thesis by the end. So that last sentence could be a decent 3-point thesis. Now, you don't always need a 3-point thesis, but if your instructor would like you to have one, here's an example of how that could come about. All right, these are back-to-back ways to think about using the word which or that. Oftentimes students want to use a comma after the word that, so I wanted to include an example of how this would work. So we have a major theme of the novel is trauma. Elwood has endured much trauma in his life and has a hard time letting go of his past. Whitehead writes that he still felt the old days in his back sometimes. So when you have the word that to introduce a quotation, it's doing the same job as a comma would do. So I could say Whitehead writes, comma, or I could say Whitehead writes that. So I don't need a comma after that because it would be redundant. They do the same job. And then on the other slide, or the other section of the slide, I have the narrator explains that. So here's a good example of Whitehead is writing, but the narrator is explaining. So make sure that you're aware of the difference when you're writing about fiction between the narrator and the author. They are not the same. The author creates a narrator, which is like another character. Even if the narrator isn't involved in any action with the characters, just that perspective comes from the creation of a persona that the writer has imagined. All right, here's a big one. So I hope you have hung on to this slide. Students want to use the word quote. It's like a thing that they think is a good idea because they are required to use quotes in their writing, and they just want to use the word quote to prove that they have used a quote. But it is not a good idea, and I will explain why. In the first sample, we have Whitehead quotes, "He still felt the old days." So quote is implying that Whitehead, the writer, is quoting himself, and he is not quoting himself. He's not like having written in a previous life this very sentence and now he's quoting it himself. He writes it. So when you're writing about literature, you write in present tense. I should have mentioned that at the outset. And this student has done that well. It wasn't something that I needed to address for revision. We just are focused on the dropped quote and the many ways that we could choose to revise that quotation, or the integration of that quotation more effectively. And so a no-no for integrating quotation is to say that a writer is quoting himself, or imply that by saying Whitehead quotes or the author of the article quotes. So avoid the word quotes. Here's another reason to do that. So this time, the introduction to the quotation is correct. Whitehead's narrator explains that. Then, after the parenthetical citation, the student says, "This quote means that." And so this use of the word quote puts too much emphasis on this sort of forced use of a quotation. You want to focus on the ideas. So using the word quote really distracts from the idea that comes from this piece of text that you are using as evidence for the existence of a certain theme or a symbol or whatever it is that you're exploring by using that bit of text in your paragraph. So avoid the word quote, and you will save yourself a lot of trouble, and your writing will seem much more advanced. You'll be more focused on ideas. So I have a handout for you that includes some signal phrases. You can print this handout, and it would be a good idea to have it if you are at all concerned about knowing how to punctuate your signal phrases, knowing what kinds of verbs to use. This one has some really good information about writing an argumentation essay. So it has a whole section on concessions and rebuttals. And really you're making an argument every time you write an essay. But some focus more on taking a stance about a certain issue, which require an examination of the other side. Then there are several other videos that explain how to integrate quotations, which will be important for you to use and review. All right, there you go. And I will answer any questions for you if you will just send me an email. Of course, the tutors are available for you to send any kind of in-text citation or paragraph or entire essay. So they will give you excellent feedback and more resources if you should need them.